Here, we'll work on creating CSS from our design. And sometimes if you're building a website or want to hand off the content to a developer, you can transform the visual designs you create in Illustrator into cascading style sheets. And in web design, CSS determines the style of the content on a web page. The content can be text or images, and the style can be, for example, in text, the font, the color, the size, and so on. So with CSS, we're talking about style as opposed to HTML, which is basically the content. And that's what we're going to do now, is create some cascading style sheets that we could use in our own website or hand off to a developer. So I'm going to go to Window and open up the CSS Properties panel. And we can see some styles in there. I'm going to click on that large blue rectangle with the ship in it. And in the CSS Properties panel, you can see some styles there. There's the name of the style and the various properties that make up that style. The background color, for example, that's a web color there, the hexadecimal number. So that's what a CSS style looks like. Now I'm going to click the dark blue rectangle at the top of the page, and in the CSS Properties panel it says no CSS code has been generated for this because the object does not have a name. And if we're going to generate CSS from an object in Illustrator, we have to name it. So with that blue rectangle selected, in the Layers panel, I'm going to click the Locate Object button, and I see that it is a sublayer of the masthead, and it's just named rectangle. It wasn't named when it was drawn. So all I have to do is double-click it and change the name to navbar. And as soon as I do that, we can see in the CSS panel that a style has now been created named navbar. And these styles can be imported and exported into other Adobe programs like Dreamweaver, which helps us build websites. Now, with the selection tool, I'm going to click to select the brown circle behind the coffee cup, and there will be no style in the CSS panel because it was not named. But we can still create CSS even without a name. So I'm going to click the Export Options button at the bottom of the Properties panel. And there in the dialog box, I'll click to make sure to generate CSS for unnamed objects, and then I'll click OK. And now we can see a style has been generated for that brown circle. It's just STO. It's a generic name for the formatting. Sometimes it's not always, it's better really to name all of your styles specific for what they are, but this can be very helpful in just generating styles for objects that you haven't named yet. So we'll work with some character styles in CSS code. In web design, CSS is very similar to character styles, where we determine, for example, the font that we're using, whether it's bold or italic, the color, the size, the leading, and so on. So character styles are similar in that respect to CSS, that are determining the styles of certain objects. And again, like I said, CSS is meant to create the style, the look of a website. I'm going to zoom in down to the footer area. And I'm going to select the text below the heading brand. And with my type tool, I'll select the entire paragraph. And I need to open up my character styles panel. I opened up just the character panel earlier by mistake, so I want to open up the character styles panel. I'll just go to Window, down to Type, and get the character styles panel. And now, with the text selected, I'll click the style name P in the Character Styles panel to apply it to the selected text. And now we see a character style named P in the CSS Properties panel. P is just an HTML code for paragraph, and this indicates that it is applied to the text in the design. And if I click on that style in the CSS panel, you can see the indicators and various parts of the style for the paragraph style. Now, I'll select the type object in the footer that contains the shopping heading. And we can see in the CSS Properties panel, we'll see a series of CSS styles listed. And we've got a lot of them. And again, this would be very useful if you were working on a website and had created this mock-up in Illustrator. You could easily just copy and paste this into a program like Dreamweaver. Illustrator can also create CSS code for graphic styles. So I'm going to open up my graphic styles panel. And I'll click on the blue rectangle behind the ship in our artwork. And in the graphic styles panel, I'm going to choose the style named Gradient Box. There, it's the last one there, so I'll click that on. And now we can see the CSS code for that style. It just gives it a generic name. But you can see the extensive code that has been generated from that graphic style. So now we may want to copy CSS in order to help develop our website. So with that rectangle still selected, I'm going to click the Copy Selected Style button at the bottom of the CSS Properties panel, and this will copy the CSS code currently showing in the panel. And now with the selection tool and the rectangle still selected, I'll shift click the brown circle to select both objects. But we don't see any code in the CSS Properties panel yet because we need to tell Illustrator to generate that code. So I'll click the Generate CSS button at the bottom of the panel. And now we see the code for two different styles. And again, we could just copy and paste this code into a program like Dreamweaver, for instance, or an editor that you're using to create your website. Now with the selection tool, I'm going to select the ship in our mockup. And we can see some code for the image. And we can apply this code to an HTML object like a div and the ping image. So I'm going to deselect that, and I'm going to drag a marquee selection across the brown circle in cup shapes to select them. And now I'll click the Generate CSS button at the bottom of the Properties panel to generate the code for that artwork. But if we were to copy the CSS code now, the images would not be created, only the code referring to them. And in order to export the image along with the code, we need to export those. And so I'm going to group those objects. And we'll work on exporting the CSS so that it exports both the code and the image. So with that group still selected, I'll click on the Export Selected CSS button at the bottom of the Properties panel, and I'll navigate to the Lesson 15 folder, into the Asset Export folder. And I'll change the file name to Asset Export. We can see that it's saving as a CSS file type. And I want to save it to the CSS export folder. And I'll click Save. And the default dialog box looks fine, so I'll just click OK. And now, when I look in that folder, the Lesson 15 folder, I see not only the CSS code, but also a PNG of that image. So that's a very useful way to export not only the code, but the image that you'll be using on a website as well. Now, that could be something that we just wanted to export just that image and the code, but generally we'd want to export all of the code and images on a mock-up like this that we're doing for a website. So I'm going to go back to Illustrator, and we'll just export the entire file. So I'll go up to File, down to Export, and over to Export As. And in the Export dialog box, I'll make sure that we're saving it as a CSS file type. And into that CSS export folder, and I'll change the file name on this to asset export _ all. And again, I want to save that to the CSS export folder, so I'll choose that and click Export. I'll leave the default settings there as they are and just click OK. And I get a little message box about an image that is already being saved, and we'll just overwrite that, so I'll click OK. That was that coffee cup image that we had exported earlier. And now, when I look in that folder that I exported it to, we can see all of the CSS and all of the images that were created for that. So that's a quick and easy way to prepare Illustrator artwork for websites and devices.